allegiance,
in the same
please?
seat.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes.
So moved.
We have a motion and a second. Any additions, deletions, or corrections? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Public input on agenda items. Anyone in the audience like to be heard today? All right. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome two new board members, Adam Harden, who is not yet here today. So I think I'll hold his bio until he comes. But so you know, he is the founding member of Soho Capital, which is the developer of the Heights project. And David Mechanic, who he's a lawyer. He's a good lawyer. Practices. He's a really good.
You're
lawyer.
having trouble with
I mean, it's not coming out too easily, Michael. I mean, what's going
No,
on?
I'm trying to figure out what to say. This is nicely done. In the areas of land use, environmental, real estate transaction, government relations, local government law, government relations, including economic incentives. He's also a certified planner of the American Institute of Planners, American Planning Association, AICP, and a Florida Supreme Court certified court mediator. Mr. Mechanic has served as chairman and member of the HART Board of Directors and has served as president, did for a number of years, for Tampa Historic Streetcar. Actually, Mr. Mechanic and I'm no longer the only last man standing. Now Dave's back. We were founding members of the Tampa Historic Streetcar Board. We actually were the incorporators of the nonprofit and have been involved ever since. So he's also served in many other boards and committees, a few of which are a member of Super Bowl and 35 and 43 task forces, something like that. Roman numerals always throw me off. Chairman and member of the Sports Authority Board of Directors, founding member and chairman of the Tampa Downtown Partnership. He currently serves with Mickey and I on the Executive Committee and Board of Directors. He's chairman of the Growth Management Planning Implementation Councils of the Greater Tampa Chamber, currently co-chairs the Policy Council, and is a member of their Board of Directors.
Okay, that's enough.
I'm almost done. I'm almost done. Let me just finish it.
Well, I waited 2 years.
You did. He is a vice chairman of the Harrisburg County Charter Review Board, which is punishment, I have no doubt, and president of the West Shore Alliance, currently serves, past president, currently serves as ex officio member of their executive committee and board of directors. Welcome, Mr. Mechanic.
Thank you.
That deserves an applause.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's a lot to have done in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not so short.
not so short.
Time is
Not so
relative.
short as it used to be. Okay, now we need an election for the board secretary treasurer, which was vacated when Mr. Jacob left the board. I spoke with Mr. Hamilton, who said he would be happy to do that to finish out this year. Could I have a
I
motion,
will
please?
nominate Mr. Hamilton.
Mr.
for that
Hamilton?
position.
We have a
And I will
second.
second that.
We have a second from Mr. Suarez. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. That's great. So streetcar system performance report. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen's had a tough week or two.
Yeah, I fully anticipate to be up here next month explaining about the plague of locusts that shut the system down for 2 days. But for the month of October, missed trips, we performed 99.56%. That was due mostly, we missed 9.5 trips. 2 of those were due to mechanical issues, and the rest were due to a crossing accident we had on October 28th, where car 429 had a van pull in front of it right down at the roundabout there at the Terminal Drive. And when we do those, it always shuts us down for a little bit. But on October 25th, a pedestrian who was walking down here between 5th and 6th Street was walking on the ballast, and the ground gave way underneath them. There was a sinkhole that was exposed. We moved 2 streetcars over it to get them to the south side. And then for 2 days, we operated with 2 cars on the city side, 1 up here in Eber, and a bus bridge in between. And while the city came in and we worked with the city to get the issue repaired, they came in and they pumped chemical grout in to seal up the hole. The hole wasn't actually underneath our track. It was going outside of it. But in the exploratory process, they came in and said, well, they thought it was a pipe. And they put some dye in the hole and pumped 300 gallons of water into it. And the water never came up in the hole, so they figured it was an awful big area. But running ground penetrating radar, they discovered that it was off to the side there behind the building that's across from the hotel. But it was, I got to give kudos to the city. They came in, they moved mountains to get us back in operation. So I think this was the first time we ever had an incident like this where we had to test, the city's ability to get us back in operation, and they were wonderful.
Good.
Other than that, we provided a lot of extra service in October. We had a good streetcar fest, and we did extra service for a number of Lightning games and the Bruno's Mars concert. And finally, under component performance, I wanted to bring to your attention that we had 39 wheelchairs in October, which is a pretty high number for us, noticing that we are handling a lot more wheelchairs on the line. I don't know what the cause is,
But you can do it, and that's important.
But we do it, yeah. So, any questions?
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Allen. Appreciate it. Legal and legislative reports.
Nothing on the legislative side. 2 items. One is direct media contract renewal. As you know, we've been renewing the direct media contract kind of on a yearly basis. Staff has kind of looked at it, and there are some additional, I would call them ultimately non-substantive changes that probably need to be made to the agreement in addition to renewing it. Our options are dependent on whether we have a meeting in December or not. If we don't have a meeting in December, then my recommendation is to go ahead and authorize the chairman to sign a 1-year renewal of the existing agreement, and then to the extent that there's changes that need to be made, essentially to update the agreement to current factual situations, we can do that at the January meeting and just amend the amendment to the agreement.
There's nothing substantive that would concern Ms. Gage?
No.
Okay.
So it's really the pleasure of the board. Probably the simplest thing at this point is to just authorize the chairman to sign and renew it on the same terms as we renewed it last year.
Okay. Good. Okay. I guess we probably should have a motion to that effect.
Okay, because we don't have a December meeting, do we? Seth?
Well, I'm going to ask that the HART staff poll our board members. If we can get a majority, and we have anything to do, we'll meet. Mm-hmm. And if not, it is closing on Christmas, which is important to some people, and some people are traveling. So
okay.
I guess we don't know yet.
Well, then I'll make the motion to allow the chair to make that decision concerning the contract without having a meeting in December.
Great.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Next.
The second item is a tri-party agreement regarding the Bernie Streetcar. For those who are familiar with it, the Tampa and Ybor Street Railway Society owns and maintains a historic antique streetcar known as the Bernie. And the society wishes to donate and transfer ownership of the Bernie and to also transfer operation and maintenance responsibilities to a responsible entity. HART and THS are the logical entities to which it should be transferred, and so they have negotiated a proposed agreement, which is before you. The reason that it's being considered now is the fact that the society, which was essentially founded by Jan Smith, and who's been the leader of that organization for many years, they wish to wind down the affairs of the corporation, so they need some place to send the Bernie. So we have an agreement before you that attempts to achieve that objective. By the agreement summarized, it provides for the donation and transfer by the Society of the Bernie Streetcar, along with funds that are currently held by the society, to HART. The funds that are currently held are roughly $24,000 to $25,000 last time we checked. Additionally, the agreement provides for the occasional use of the Bernie streetcar by the former officers of the society. I think it provides for twice a year. They and their friends can essentially utilize the Bernie. The operation, use, maintenance, budgeting, and repair of the Bernie streetcar is to be assumed by HART under the agreement, and that will last for 20 years. It can extend beyond 20 years, but the minimum obligation is 20 years. Additionally, the agreement provides for the possible donation of the Bernie streetcar by HART to a not-for-profit museum at the end of that 20-year period. The parties agree that it's time to put it to rest in the museum. As far,
so to speak.
yeah,
Not bury it, just park it someplace, right?
the agreement also provides for the monitoring and, if needed, possible funding of expenditures for maintenance, repairs, and restoration and use of the Bernie. THS's funding obligation is going to be essentially an as needed, if possible, obligation.
Right.
So the assumption here is that at least to start, we've got $24,000 or $25,000 that can be used for that. Under the terms of the agreement, HART will come up with a budget for the maintenance and operation of it, and we'll bring it to THS. THS will review and approve it as part of their normal budgetary process. And to the extent that there may be additional funding needed over and above the amounts that are being transferred over, that will be something that THS will be responsible for, assuming that we have the available funds. So that's basically what the agreement provides for. We've negotiated it with the HART folks, and also the chairman has been in discussions with the society members, and so this agreement is reflecting what the agreement is that's been reached thus far. My recommendation is that you approve the agreement as drafted and authorize the chairman to execute the agreement on behalf of the board.
Thank you, David.
Question.
Yes.
Is there anything in there that has HART or THS obligated to operate the Bernie on any? Are there any minimum obligations for operating the Bernie on the system or anything like that?
Technically, no, but it is supposed to be operated. It has to be available at least twice a year for the society members, the former officers of the corporation.
But do you have force majeure language in there? If it's not operable, either that event gets postponed or, I'm just thinking of a situation where it's not currently operable. We don't want to be in default under the agreement kind of thing.
Well, I say it's not. I stand corrected. HART is responsible for ongoing maintenance, repairs, and related costs of the Bernie streetcars from the funds transferred by the society, and that is under a heading called ongoing operating responsibilities and costs. Mm-hmm. So I think the premise here is it's going to be operated. The exact scope of those operations is going to be determined by THS and HART, and obviously the ability to keep it operating and maintaining it is going to be a factor that's going to play in.
Okay.
Question. So, was there monies that were coming along with this from the society?
Correct.
How much is that? Because I was looking through it.
It's about
It's between
$25,000.
24 and 25,000.
Okay. And Michael, you probably remember this. I had talked to the society about having it housed at the History Museum,
Right.
the Bernie.
Right.
That never went anywhere.
No.
I know. I remember it never went. No, that's a declarative. It wasn't a question.
Yeah. We tried.
We tried, and the idea was that it would be housed at the History Museum on rails. We could inlay rails there so that people could see it at the History Museum without necessarily having to ride a more modern streetcar and see what it was like. And then we could use it for special occasions, such as what they're talking about here. And they're already talking about donating it to a museum, so I'm not sure why they don't want to do it now. And
The History Museum doesn't want it now.
They still don't want it now. Okay, all right. But I know that before they didn't have a problem with it. They were looking at putting a spot there for it.
Maybe so, but they really said no.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that they would have been a better idea, but and we could have housed it and done everything else with
So
it.
where
But
will
this
it
is
be
good.
stored then?
Right where it is now here.
Here, inside the building? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, Miss Egan's been very, very nice about keeping it inside, and actually
And covered and
they've done some work on it,
Yeah.
and she's all, everybody seems to be fine with this, and truthfully, its value is largely symbolic. I mean, restoring that car was really what brought the idea of really building a streetcar system, brought it to the public's attention and the elected officials' attention, and then kept it there for almost 20 years. So it's a beautiful little car. It really doesn't make much sense to run it very often because it's not handicapped accessible, and it takes some special training to drive it.
Yeah.
Blah blah blah. But HART seemed to be very amenable to this, and I assume Sylvia has looked at this, and
Yes, she has.
it's all good.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, I'm real happy about this, and so is the remains of the Streetcar Society. The ladies, everyone in the Streetcar Society is either passed away or getting old, and it's not it hasn't really been very active since THS was formed, which kind of took over the reins of marketing the streetcar system. So it's a nice thing to help. It's nice for you to take it. It's nice for them to get it off their hands and put it in an appropriate place.
Move approval, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
I'll
you.
second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. So I assume this goes to a HART committee and then the HART board as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank
That's
you.
all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, David. Chair's report. I am really happy to have Stephen Shoecraft here with us this afternoon with HDR. He is the project manager for the streetcar extension, and Catherine was nice enough to invite him to give us a kind of an update on where the study is.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for having us out. I should apologize in advance. Many of you have seen some version of this presentation over the last couple months. We've been out quite a bit in doing briefings, and we did a large-scale public workshop in last month that we had very good attendance, and we've also gotten a fair amount of attention in the press, I think, and pretty good, kind of solid coverage, so we've been happy about that. This presentation is a fairly brief presentation. Michael, should I just sort of run through it, or do you
I
want
would
to?
just run through it.
Okay.
I'm not sure who here has seen this and who hasn't.
Okay.
But I think it would be helpful for at least the short version.
So the intention of this, we sort of distilled a lot of the information that we've presented in other forums. So this is meant to be a fairly quick overview briefing, and we can drill down into any level of detail once I get through the bulk of the presentation. So it's an overview, a little bit about the stakeholder and public outreach process that we followed. We're at a stage now where we've looked at extension options and we've evaluated those options and we've made a recommendation about how to proceed. And we've outlined next steps. So in the context of the entire study, it's important to keep in mind that we're about 30% through the entire process. The phase one is looking at modernization and extension alternatives. If there's a promising alternative out of that process, and we think there probably is, that would move into more detailed analysis in phase two. This is focused on finding a solution for the existing streetcar system and an extension to the system so it provides a real solid support for the city's economic development and improves mobility options across the broad definition of what downtown is. The process includes alternatives for modernization and extension. We're in no way imagining that there would be a different kind of streetcar with the existing heritage streetcar remaining in operation, that this is sort of a single project as we imagine it, both modernization of the existing and extension. We're looking at the basic cost, both capital and operating costs, benefits to the community, impacts to the community as part of the feasibility study, and then we'll move into greater detail during phase two when we're in project development. And through that process, we're also looking at innovative technologies for the streetcar operations. So we have the heritage vehicles, we're looking at modern streetcar vehicles, and we're also looking at potentially autonomous rubber tire vehicles as a potential alternative to think about how the system works. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get further into it. Through the process, we're coordinating very closely with the regional transit feasibility plan process. So they're at a point now where they're starting to look at not just the big fat lines on the map that connect regional activity centers, but they're starting to drill down further into specific alignments. And so our coordination is becoming more intense now because streetcar has a potential to either connect or to play an integrated role in that regional transit service. So as I mentioned, it's a two-phase process. We're completing the feasibility work now. That includes some of the basic work that we go through as planners early in a process to look at the purpose and need for the project. So this is really the fundamental questions about what the local objectives are and how streetcar can serve those objectives. Alignment concepts, so alternative alignment concepts for an extension. Evaluate those concepts, identify a preferred option, thinking about both extension and the modernization of the existing line, and then looking at funding and implementation strategies. So of all those tasks, we're looking now at the question about funding and implementation strategies. So in a recent meeting, someone asked me if I'm going to address the elephant in the room. So my response was, there's many elephants, which one? So one of those is funding, obviously. Who's going to pay for not just to build it, whatever, depending on how it's defined exactly. But a series of other questions that we're starting to look at. How does it cross CSX? How do we deal with it crossing the downtown interchange footprint? How does that relate to the downtown interchange as those plans evolve? So there's a whole set of questions that we still have to move into as we get into phase two. Phase two gets us into the more detailed, like a PD&E process for a roadway project or another sort of transit project, where we look more carefully at the exact alignment, the exact vehicle and power technologies. We drill down into more detail in funding and implementation. At the end of that process, we need to be able to go to FTA, to DOT at the state level and the local level with specific commitments about who's going to fund what portions of the capital investment and how we're going to commit to deliver quality service through operations. Throughout the process, we've had a pretty intensive public engagement process, and that was baked into our scope from the beginning. So the way the DOT scoped the project, working with the city, included a significant amount of outreach, public workshops, and then a series of briefings with stakeholders around the region. So this is primarily funded by DOT, with the city kicking in a significant portion of the cost for the consultant team's work. HART, as the operator, has been a strong partner. They're on our study management team. And then our team includes a series of specialty consultants looking at specific elements of the project. So we have a national streetcar group, so we're doing streetcar projects around the country. We're bringing that expertise to the project. But we've also got specialists in funding and finance, in impact assessments, operations, maintenance and storage facility design, and other specialties. So the engagement process during the first phase, we had 4 large-scale public workshops. I think pretty good turnout, around between 60 to 100 people at each of those sessions. We sort of walked people through our thinking about what the purpose and need for the project was, what the general ideas about extension options. We got a lot of feedback through that process, and following those processes, the most recent meeting was the end of October, where we presented our recommendations for the extension and sort of clarified and tried to talk through what our next steps were so people understood, where we fit in the entire process. Throughout the effort, we've had a whole series of agency stakeholder meetings with DOT, HART staff, Planning Commission, MPO, Port Authority, T-BART, Athea, Hillsborough County, and staff and the consultant team have reached out through a series of briefings and meetings with individual property owners, neighborhood associations, stakeholder groups. We've been trying to make sure that we're available, and staff has made a significant commitment to get out to let people know what we're up to. So what we've gone through is a process to define a series of extension options. So this map and all this sort of spaghetti lines on the map indicate the 7 different alignment extension options that we looked at. So we had both north-south extensions, east-west cross-cutting extensions that crossed the river, and then we had some extensions that took the existing end of the line at at Marion and then looped it around to go back to either Channel District or Ybor City in different ways. When we drew these were based on early discussions about where people wanted the streetcar to go and how they thought it should perform across these broad districts that we've defined as downtown for the purpose of the study. When we evaluated it, we developed 32 different measures of how the project could perform or what the nature of the impacts were for the project across these 11 categories. The 11 categories were the purpose and need statements. So these are more statements of visions and objectives for the project. Connect downtown subdistricts, serve diverse travel markets, improve first mile, last mile connections, support economic development, and expand sustainable transportation options. The other set are more performance and impact, kind of the basic metrics about how a system could perform. So that's population and employment served, which is the basis for ridership projections, and that's one of the key measures and one of the key factors that FTA and DOT at the state level will be looking at. The capital and operating costs, and then we cut those costs by track miles, by ridership, and by other factors, so we could look at the sort of efficiency of the investment. What is the benefit we're getting out of a certain level of investment? We looked at constructability and operational constraints, so utility impacts, river crossings, highway underpass crossings. We looked at traffic and parking impacts, and then community and environmental impacts. We took all the measures, and these were numerical measures. We translated those into ranges, high and low, for ratings, and then we developed what's on the next page. So I'll preview that with this slide, but the next page shows how that red dot green exercise worked in the rating process. A lot of the difference in these were really a function of how we drew them when we developed the alternatives. Some of the east-west alignments are particularly long to cross the river in the stretch into West Tampa, where we're seeing a significant uptick in development in North Hyde Park in West Tampa. Those longer ones didn't stack up as well as the shorter lines because they weren't serving on a per track mile or per distance basis, just weren't serving the higher levels of population and employment. So that's one of the places where they started to separate. So you can see for A and B and F, F was the shortest small loop, those were obviously the least cost because it's the least track and least power. They also required the least number of new vehicles to support service on the extension. So those are in the $90 to $100 million range for the extension costs and the vehicles to serve the extension. The longer ones go up to 125 to 180, and that's just a function of the amount of track that we would need to lay out to look at that total cost of the project. One of the places that you can see that from a performance standpoint, we did average weekday boardings, and these are very conservative, sort of careful numbers. We're not trying to overplay the potential ridership right now. We're just trying to start it as a comparison basis. When we get into the next phase, we'll look at this in more detail. But we're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 riders, weekday riders across the alternatives, and you can see that you get 2,200 for A and B, but with about half the track miles as you get for slightly higher ridership on CD. So it's one of the reasons that A and B starts to look a little bit more efficient. The population employment served within a quarter mile was an important number. And when we looked at, one of our scores was population employment served by track mile and by cost.
Chair, can I ask a real quick question?
Mm-hmm.
The modernization cost that you have at the bottom, range 62 to 75, is that included in the capital cost at all? Or
No,
is that
so what
separate? That's on top of?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's on top of, because we just wanted to isolate the extension so we could compare them apples to apples across.
I just wanted to make sure because I've seen this twice, and it's the first time I thought about asking you this question.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
because now that changes my mind. I don't think we ought to build anything at all. I'm kidding. That was a joke.
Delete from Hollywood.
I'm going to throw Michael off. That's all.
We did it. We used the FTA's format to develop the pricing, and we used information from recently completed projects. So we think we have a pretty good solid set of numbers for the comparison. But we did split them out that way. So there is.
And there's a separate
isolating the
bucket of
extension.
money to get modernization costs too, correct? That are separate from some of these other costs? Because I think that, like for new cars, new vehicles, is that separate or is that going to be in addition to? Because
No,
you know,
the
you're-
vehicles that, so there's a set of assumptions which I should have explained, I apologize.
It's my fault for not listening
No,
to you
no.
the first time or the
The
second time.
assumptions that roll into these numbers, it assumes modern streetcar vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So replacing the existing vehicles with modern streetcar vehicles, like those that are running in Dallas and
Right.
Kansas City and Seattle and Portland and elsewhere, DC, Atlanta. That sort of modern vehicle, a double track for the extension, so you can have passing tracks across the whole extent of the extension. You don't just have little pockets of passing tracks as you do now. And it assumed the number of vehicles required, and the operating cost assumes that it would be an 18 to 20 hour service at 10 to 15 minute headways across that service period. So this is a high level of service assumed that's built into these costs.
Okay. And when it comes to vehicles anyway, I mean, we do this all the time with the buses, correct? When we go back to the feds and, you know, we usually have to go through them in order to get new vehicles. A lot of times we get grants either from the state or the federal government to buy those new vehicles. So chances are we might be able to get modern streetcars for this after being approved for some FTA dollars once we know what our local match is going to be.
Yeah, that's one of
possible.
the things that we're looking at now with the funding and implementation plan is how FTA will look at the extension as distinct from modernization of the existing system.
Okay.
So that like small starts money and new starts money would be money focused on the extension and what would be required to extend the system. We don't know that if we could use that money for the modernization.
Okay, I just wanted to get a clear picture of it because if you're asking on the low end, 62 million added to, let's say, option B, which is 97 million, you know, it makes a different kind of discussion item when you're talking
Yeah.
about 158 million dollars as opposed to it being only 97 million dollars. I love the way
Yeah.
I said just only 97 million dollars. So
I know, this is the first time I understood that, too.
is it really? See now I don't feel so bad. I mean,
No, you shouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I shouldn't have, but
Noted. I
Question
appreciate that.
about that.
Sure.
Follow up on
sure.
Mr. Suarez. Do we also have an issue with the feds in terms of the existing cars not having realized their full useful life under the original grants for the streetcars?
Yes, that's another thing that we're looking at is we're just, Jeff Booth, who works with HART, I think you probably all know Jeff from previous work, he's helping us understand that existing federally funded set of assets and how changing those assets would influence the project.
So they're
So they're-
saleable. They are saleable.
Yeah, they have a value. We looked at that a couple of years ago when we did some work for HART on the extension. We haven't revisited that question, but they do have there's a market for those vehicles, and it's a possibility to sell them to another system. It's also a possibility to buy more of those vehicles if we didn't go to a modern vehicle.
Yeah,
But
I hope that doesn't happen, but
I was just going to say, though, that if, at least under the worst case scenario, and hopefully we
You
won't
could-
see that, we would have to pay the feds back for the unamortized value of the cars, so you would need to sell them in order to have that
Exactly,
money. I'm
exactly.
saying worst case, I don't know,
Yeah.
but that is a theoretical possibility.
right.
It's a theoretical possibility. There could be a way that's the compensation for that could be in the city's commitment of right-of-way and other improvements, which would be part of the city's match to the project. So it wouldn't be a cash match, but it would be an asset match.
And just so everybody understands, our current cars hold, 45 people sitting and standing? Something like that, 50? And the new cars, which are articulated and longer, can hold twice that many people?
Yeah, that's
One
80
more?
to 100 depending on the configuration. So if for a system, several of the new systems are really designed for short trips, so they have a lot of room for standing. So they have minimal seats along the side. Those can get up to 100 and 120 for capacity. So when we look at the different alternatives for the vehicle technology, that's one of the things that we have to compare is if we assume a certain level of service, what is required from an investment standpoint to meet that level of service? How many heritage vehicles to provide that number of trips? How many rubber tire autonomous vehicles to provide that level of service? That's what we'll move into as one of the first pieces of phase two.
I'm sorry, one more question. Do you know any of these vehicles have electric diesel or diesel electric? Is diesel to electric, as opposed to having a overhead? I know that some of them run on at surface electric connections, and then we have ours.
They're in Europe. They have the electric embedded in the track system.
Right.
It's sort of like a cable car, but electric, not drugged by the
Any
cables.
difference in pricing between what we've got now, which is a type, and I don't mean the car itself, but the type of electrical, system that we run the vehicles on, and something different?
We looked at HDR did a study for HART maybe 3 years ago now, where we did it. It was a very small, tight little study, but we're just trying to figure out what the options were. When we looked at modernization, we had one of our consultants, LTK, who does power work for systems around the country, both light rail and heavy rail. They looked at a strategy to upgrade the existing trolley wire to a catenary system, and it wasn't a big ticket overall. So we can use the existing transformers and a lot of the infrastructure, and it's really changing out the wire and the connector.
Well, I'm looking at it from the opposite way, which is to get rid of the overhead.
From a technology standpoint, you asked about the diesel electric. Most of the systems are overhead wire for portions of the system with off-wire battery power, and that battery technology is what's improving really quickly.
Yeah.
So the extent of the off-wire sections are getting greater.
And that's my question about the difference in pricing, which is that if we replaced it without having I can never say what that
Overhead
thing is.
catenary.
Catenary. I always get that screwed up. The overhead catenary, as opposed to doing it completely through the system, because the problem I have with any of especially the older streetcars, I do not like the overhead wires at all. I think that's a problem, especially here in Hurricane Alley. I don't like that system. I think that we could probably find a better system to be able to put that in, but I don't know what that cost is. So
It's mostly in the vehicle, the battery capacity of the vehicle is one of the longest runs I'm aware of is in Dallas, where it crosses the Trinity River. That bridge was a historic bridge, and one of the conditions was they couldn't put wires up across the bridge.
Right.
And that's a pretty long stretch where it runs on battery. Mm-hmm. Then it picks it up at the end of the bridge and recharges. So it's charging while it's on wire. It's running and charging while it's on wire, and then it charges up, and it can take a stretch across the bridge without
And there's one
issues with battery capacity.
There's one in Portland, and I guess Fort Lauderdale is planned to have a battery to take across a bridge.
Some stretch of battery run across the what is that river called?
That little river.
Runs just south of downtown. So the river that runs south of downtown, it crosses a bridge, a movable bridge. What is it?
New River.
The New River. There's a short stretch there. So the Dallas stretch is probably 5 times that distance. I don't know what the distance is, but we did that project and developed that.
Is it possible
system.
that the battery development that Elon Musk and others are doing could result in batteries sophisticated and powerful enough to do away with overhead? Where I understand it's playing out fastest is in bus technology, so electric bus technology and the charging system. Mm-hmm. So there's rapid charging at stops where there's this overhead thing that sits over the bus queues up, it sits over it, it's rapid charges while it's boarding, and then it heads off. And then there's the battery braking, recapture, and generation of power as they're moving along. But
I think it's happening really fast. There's not a streetcar technology, but I think in a year or two we'll know more.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're in that difficult position, and I'll talk about that more with autonomous vehicles. There's not the ideal vehicle to replace a streetcar right now, but there could be. There's one in China that's tracks on striping and looks like a streetcar, and
I've seen that.
there's the smaller shuttles, but those guys will get bigger as they figure out how much capacity they need to provide a decent level of transit service. So,
well, what about? I think you started to talk about it, but I don't think you fully explained it. What about the system where the track is electrified? You were saying that is in Europe now.
That is my understanding is that's substantially more expensive than the overhead power system. Both from a construction cost, and then you have issues with more expensive maintenance issues if you have an issue with an overhead power. There's not. I don't believe that there's any of those vehicle types that are currently nothing like that's operating in the U.S. So to meet the Buy America requirements, that could be difficult to get a vehicle that use that technology.
Aren't the New York subways, some of the tracks
The
electrified?
heavy rail are, but they're not running in exclusive right of way. I mean, they're all fenced and separate.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah, so all the heavy rail has it as third rail systems. All the light rail, where it crosses surface streets and it's running sometimes in mixed traffic, all have overhead in the U.S.
So where did we leave off?
Well, we'll click up. I only have a couple more slides. It's pretty quick. So the way that we roll up these numbers, we try to do it in this sort of simple format. The background for this is in a 50-page report with an explanation of all the measures and how we scored everything. And there's a big matrix that you can print out that has all the explanation of how we converted those to this dot exercise. But it really comes down to the fact that A, B, and F really are the ones that serve the most population and employment with the least amount of track miles. And so they tick up in terms of the rating primarily because of that factor. So they have the best potential for ridership at the lowest cost. And that, relative cost compared to the other options. We're not saying it's a low cost option overall. They, in a certain sense, a lot of these score similarly across the purpose and need categories. They meet local objectives. It's just really how they perform from a cost standpoint. And we can go back and talk more about that bit. But what I wanted to do is the summary of the recommendations right now is that we're talking with the city about a north-south extension along some combination of Franklin, Tampa, and Florida. So the way that we drew the options, there would be double tracks that would run all the way up Franklin to Palm and back with possibly a short loop at the north end. And then another option that would run north on Florida, south on Tampa, likely taking up a parking lane on either street. That specific detail, exactly how it would run, is something that we need to move into in phase 2 and really test that impact on traffic and on the quality of the operations. We include modernization of the existing system with the assumption that regardless of the vehicle technology, that you could take a trip from Ybor City all the way across the system north through the core of downtown to Tampa Heights as a one-seat trip. So we're not suggesting that we divide it up and you have one vehicle running on one end and another vehicle running on the other end. We're trying to keep this as one integrated system. The possibility exists, and this is important for the regional transit feasibility plan discussion, is that this system could extend further, that there's nothing specific about what we're doing that would limit it from going west across the river, going as far as West Shore, or going north, Seminole Heights, or further. That a modern streetcar vehicle has the capacity and the speed and can run in different operating environments, so it's a pretty flexible alternative. We're struggling with this question about how to keep this project at an appropriate scale to attract the local investment and to be competitive at the Fed level to get federal money. And that's when we look at the implementation plan, that's one of the things that we'll be testing. Would it be more competitive if it was bigger investment? Would it be more competitive if it was smaller and more modest? We're not sure about that yet. And we haven't seen really strong signals from FTA about what they're going to likely support under the new administration. There hasn't been any clear sense of direction coming from them about projects like this. So to sort of roll that up, the recommendation is modernization of the existing line, but that's going to be based on the vehicle selection. The AB extension, because of that relatively low cost, strong ridership potential, and the first mile, last mile link to Marion Transit Center or the intermodal site at the 275 interchange, with the potential for future extensions. And then in the next step, we'll drill down further in the alignment plans to really look at exactly where it goes, where it turns, where the stations are. We'll grapple with questions about going north on Franklin through the Esplanade, which is it's the perfect straight line, but that's a significant reconstruction of that space to make it work, if we can get access to the space, because it's not currently public right away. We'll look at the transit modes, so we'll try to compare running heritage streetcars with modern streetcars with some sort of an autonomous rubber tire vehicle. And autonomous is not really critical. Whether there's a driver or not doesn't really make a significant difference in the kind of service provided. So we'll be trying to compare these by the kind and level of service. And whether there's a driver or not, there's a cost factor, but that you may be spending more for autonomy than you are for a driver. We haven't puzzled through the cost for that yet, but we'll be looking at that. Then we'll get into more detailed cost and ridership estimating, impact assessment, and a detailed funding plan. So that's the current state.
Questions?
Just one. Modern streetcar couldn't be autonomous also, even on rail.
I'm sure it will be in the future, and that would be the easiest way to pilot it. We have autonomous rubber tire at the airport now because it's in a fixed guideway. It's a controlled fixed guideway. That would be a likely future condition.
Okay. And what is considered the optimal distance for, let's say, a commuter rail?
Commuter rail?
Yeah. If you don't know, that's okay too.
I mean, most commuter rails are long haul, veteran community to employment center trips.
5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles?
10, 20.
10, 20?
Most of the ones are that
longer.
trip with stations, a fair distance apart, a couple miles apart.
Yeah. Okay.
And usually fed by parking ride facilities, parking garages, until it gets to an employment core, and then it's serves the employment core.
I'm asking for a reason. I just want to make sure because there's a lot of talk about a lot of different things right now, and there's a lot of rail that's available that should probably be considered commuter rail and not get jumbled into what we're talking about with streetcar because there's a lot of confusion when people talk about this, and I think you know what I'm talking about when you talk about the premium, study right now, premium transit study. It's we're not going to do streetcar from USF to downtown Tampa. At least in my mind, I don't think.
No, I mean, there's even a difference between a light rail system, which might be 10 or 12 miles long, and a commuter rail system.
Right.
Sun Rail, that's a commuter rail system. It uses trains. Those are real trains on that.
Those are real.
Big
They're
trains.
diesel engines in a full
So people
heavy
can-
rail
People
environment.
can travel for 45 or 50 minutes on them. The classic is the Long Island Railroad. That's a commuter train that's been in
Or
existence.
CTA in Chicago, and
Exactly. I have two questions. I assume, just because I know how competent you and your team are, that you're thinking through downtown development strategies. I hope you are, because the development that Mr. Vinnick's company is going to do is going to be profound. You have some concerns about how profound, I know. The Heights project, I'm glad Adam isn't here so we can talk about it. It's also going to be profound, and it's over $1 billion worth of development. And so connecting that to a streetcar seems to me to be really critical to allow that area to compete with Mr. Vinnick. The same question on a different scale is true about a single double track versus the double track separated by several blocks. I remember learning that most streetcar systems in places like Portland and Seattle tend to most influence property developers within a block of.
It's compared to like a light rail TOD.
Exactly.
It's fairly tight.
The
it's a
TOD is
tighter
fairly
impact.
tight, so it would stand to reason that if you could separate them and go up Florida and down Tampa, you're influencing 4 or 5 or 6 blocks instead of 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that that's really going to be another thing that you guys really pay attention to, because if you're going to bother to double track, you should get the biggest bang that you can.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea of going up Franklin's nice. I always thought it was probably the thing to do, but I don't anymore, because if you can capture a broader corridor, and there's a lot of property in there that wants to be developed or redeveloped, then it would seem to me to be smart.
Stretch out the benefit.
And the other question is the one I asked you when I saw you the last time, which is, what happens if the raise deal happens? And I said this to you also, that I don't see how you cannot, you still have to go to the Heights, but I don't see how you can't create a loop and make it a two-way system so that all of the people that are going to want to come there can park in all kinds of various places to get there because there simply won't be enough parking in the immediate vicinity. So, but even setting that logic aside, if in 6 months it's Hillsborough County and the mayor and the Rays announce a funding plan, what will you do with this study? You probably do as you're told, but
Yes, exactly. Whatever the client would like us to do. We, as a consultant, we would probably be talking about an adjustment in our scope to look at that impact of the Ray Stadium location, because there's challenges given the existing vehicles, and it's a one-way system. How do you serve if there's 10,000 people average per game, if there's 15,000, 20,000? Streetcar in its current configuration is only going to pick up so many of those trips. Streetcar just heading down to downtown is going to pick up a certain additional number.
Right.
And then if the loop allows you to run them either direction to destination. So you could have
if you have 6 or 8 new cars,
and
going
a service
both
adjustment
directions,
to run both directions.
you could move a lot of people in an hour.
So we would want to get into if there's a more, I can't characterize the level of commitment to the current proposal, but
Right.
when that gets more solid, assuming it might, we'd want to look at that more carefully. And I think we'd look at we drew it along 7th Avenue because it was a direct shot, but we could also look at Henderson, and that should be opened up through the downtown interchange work. And we could look at Palm. So you'd want to stack those up against one another for the east-west trip, and then figure out from an operations planning standpoint, how would you adjust service on those peak periods when you're trying to really feed the stadium?
Right. Or as I mentioned to you before, you could use CAS.
And
empower Encore and all those blocks and Hillsborough County employees and Tampa Park Apartments on your way to the loop close, and then you're stimulating enormously more redevelopment potential than any other alignment that I can think of.
Yeah, the one disappointing result of the analysis is that we don't provide great service to Encore. It's still a bit of a distance from the line, and that's
I think that's a really big deal. If I were the housing authority, and I don't know if they've weighed in with you or not, or whether it matters, but I mean that development is going to struggle mightily to become really mixed use and public and private stuff with all the competition it's going to get. And those other poor, miserable, flat blocks all around it are simply the least desirable place to develop unless you give people a reason.
Right.
But I'm preaching to the choir right now. Any other questions? Stephen, thank you very much. That was a nice presentation.
I had one. Your phase 2 is authorized. You are already started on it, or?
We've moved into a little bit of phase 2 because we're trying to get enough information to write a compelling letter to FTA to be accepted into project development. So there's some phase 2 work we've done. The money's committed for the entire study. It's really up to the city and DOT how far they want to move into that before FTA indicates that they believe it's a promising project for federal money. So that's a discussion that's happening now.
How much you complete in phase 2 depends on the kind of feedback you get from FDA.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks very much for coming. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Executive Officers Report.
There's no report for this month.
Oh, darn it.
I wonder why. But
Direct Media Sales Report, Ms. Gage.
Good afternoon, Laurie Gage with Direct Media. We look forward to working with you again with the contract renewal if that goes through. We very much appreciate the relationship. One of the things that's not on here, Miller Coors did renew we got the paperwork on that, so we can look forward to that revenue. Working on potentially Tito's Vodka and a Bay Harbor Hotel here locally. And that's about all I have for you today. Any questions or?
No, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that's it. Unless anyone has a question, Steve, anything you need to report? Oh, Abby does.
Real quick, I just wanted to let everyone know some great news about the Winter Village Express. It was a brainchild of one of our downtown CRA advisory committee members. So we always like when they get involved and want to continue the streetcar adventures. And then the downtown partnership really took it on and ran with it to create a neat program for families on Sunday afternoons. They worked hard to decide on which date would be best. They wanted to avoid Saturdays since we were already doing that for free, and really make this an opportunity. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot more ridership than we anticipate, and we may have a little bit of feedback that we need more cars for it, but that would be a great problem to have.
Yeah, really.
So we welcome it, and we just hope that everyone is patient knowing that it's our inaugural trip and that we hope to continue to expand it. But
And be
anyone
sure
have
and
any
watch for the
questions
Winter
about
Village
that?
Express streetcar.
yes.
Too bad we can't drive the streetcar to the Winter Village, you know?
That is a problem, but
It is. And that was actually the big deterrent from starting this was, well, there's still quite a big gap. But I think the partnership, specifically Sean Drinkard, has put a lot of time and effort into figuring out a way to program it and make people at the end of the trip know how to get to the trip citizen and vice versa.
so thank you. I think there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.